Hey, welcome along. Way back in 2006, without quite intending to, I wound up writing a bestseller about demography, which is harder to do than you might think. I'm not a demographer. I just did my usual mix of a few little penetrating anecdotes, a few devastating statistics, a lot of cheap jokes, and a bit of connective material to tie it all together. And my book, America Alone, wound up an international bestseller about demography, which, as I said, is harder to do than you might think. And people still talk about it. Just in the last couple of weeks, I've been damned for that book in both The Guardian in the United Kingdom and the New York Times on this side of the Atlantic, and the guy who wrote the piece in the New York Times is some starry-eyed sentimentalist about mass immigration, and was trying to, what do they call it, troll me on Twitter, sticking my Twitter handle in to try and attract me into commenting on his otherwise unread piece. But the lesson I learned from that is that when you stray into matters demographic, even if you're just talking statistics, you get damned as an Islamophobe and a racist and a thisist and a thatist and a thisophobe and a thatophobe and all the rest of it. So I'm always interested to see how other fellas handle it. And there's a guy called Stephen Smith, impeccably respectable guy, and he's just written a book called The Scramble for Europe. And he spends a lot of time in France, and so it was published in French first. And I read it. I read most of it until his French prose began to give me a bit of a headache, and I stopped. But I don't agree with everything in it. I don't subscribe to many of the theories he posits there, but it's actually a fascinating book about the central question of our time. He's called it, in English, the English title is The Scramble for Europe, Young Africa on its Way to the Old Continent. And if you hear distant imperial echoes in that title, that refers to the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, when basically Britain, France, Germany, other European powers to a lesser extent, carved up the continent for themselves. Africa became an entire continent that, with the exception of one or two holdouts like Liberia and Ethiopia, was wholly owned by another continent, Europe, to the north. So when you call a book The Scramble for Africa, The Scramble for Europe, evoking the scramble for Africa, you're consciously evoking something like a reverse takeover, the precise inversion of what happened in the late 19th century. And Stephen Smith, it was interesting to me. I saw his book because I happened to read a couple of reviews of it and a couple of items in the French press about it by people who didn't really bother engaging with the thesis of the book or this or that aspect of the book, but instead basically just damned him as a racist. He wasn't supposed to be talking about this issue at all, which itself is very interesting. But for me, it brought back memories of what happened when I did my own book. In this case, he's a far more respectable fellow than I am. But no matter how coolly, how dispassionately, how non-emotionally you address this issue, the powers that be don't want you addressing it at all. The idea, particularly if you call your book The Scramble for Europe, that we're in some kind of reversal of the 19th century scramble for Africa, is interesting. As you know, I'm an imperialist. In another of my books, After America, I quote a splendid fellow called Charles Onyango Obo, who's a columnist for the East African. And I quote a piece he wrote a few years ago referencing the resurgence of cannibalism in things like the Congolese Civil War. And Mr. Onyango Obo, who's like a big guy in the East African press, mentions that there's an advantage to colonization if it comes from a more advanced power. That if you're colonized by chaps who arrive from Europe, when they clear off, they'll at least have left you with some roads. They'll have left you with some airstrips. They'll have left you with schoolhouses and courthouses. Not because they want to do you any favors, but just because that's the infrastructure they need to be able to live in the land they've colonized. And I think that's undoubtedly true, that whatever one feels about imperialism, whatever one feels about colonization, the infrastructure that was bequeathed to those African nations on independence in the 60s and 70s was actually quite impressive. Unfortunately, the last half century has not been impressive in terms of African self-governance. So a lot of Africans, quite reasonably enough, want to get out of Africa. A couple of years ago, I spent some time in Reutlingen refugee houses with some Gambians who were like, I would say they were pushing 30. They're just beginning to get a touch of the old crow's feet around the eyes and a little bit of the old receding hairline. So they were like 30-year-old West Africans pretending to be 17-year-old Middle Easterners, fleeing the Syrian civil war and fleecing the German refugee system, German welfare system. And they were great, terrific company. When you were in their rooms for too long, the pot got a bit heady in their generous German refugee accommodation, and I preferred to step out into the yard. But they were very interesting and enlightening on why they had made their way from the Gambia in West Africa to the coast of Libya and across and over to Italy and then up to Germany to enjoy the benefits of Northern European welfare systems. It is in itself a system for funneling, for the cost of a couple of $1,000, you can get from whichever benighted part of Africa you're in to those German welfare centers. The Gambia is a tiny little strip of a country in West Africa. It was ruled for many years by Sir Dawda Jawara, who they attempted to depose when he was in London attending the wedding of Lady Diana and the Prince of Wales. And he required a bit of Senegalese help to prop him back on his throne when they toppled him during his absence in London. But the point about the Gambia is, if you go back a century, let's go back to, say, 1920, the Gambia had a population of about 180,000. Which is about the population of a smallish European town. Trondheim in Norway, for example, 180,000. Right now, the population, a century later, is over 2 million. And by mid-century, 2050, it's expected to be over 4 million. It's going to double in the next 30 years, more or less. So from being the population of Trondheim, a modestly sized town in Norway, it's going to have a population the same size as Norway, population as large as Norway's. This is the story of African population growth in the last half century. It's exploded. This isn't any kind of racist conspiracy theory, it's just a fact. These are the UN statistics. And every couple of years, the UN Statistics Division has to revise its statistics and revise them upwards because they're always lowballing the estimates. But right now, for example, there's roughly 1 billion people in Africa, and by 2050, it's going to be just shy of 2.5 billion. And by the end of the century, it's going to be 4 billion. And don't worry about a lot of these numbers, because the the takeaway is this. This is the fastest population growth ever recorded. So that you have Nigeria, the capital of Nigeria, Lagos, is now one of the biggest cities on earth. 21 million people. That's 2.5 times the size of London or New York. A city that half a century ago was the size of Newark, New Jersey. So you have population growth on a scale that has never before been seen in the history of our planet. This means something. We can argue about what it means, but to suggest that it's irrelevant to the future of the planet is completely preposterous. And in particular, as Stephen Smith's book suggests, it's significant for Europe, which is just a short step across the Mediterranean to get to the most generous welfare systems on the planet. And we've already seen the way Europe is convulsed every so often by these little episodes where some Euro do-gooders pick up some so-called refugees from the Libyan coast where the ports are controlled by various ISIS affiliates, and then tries to sail up to Italy and to land them in Mediterranean Europe, despite the objections of the local government, often with the encouragement of other governments, such as the Germans. And people are fascinated by this, even though these little ships are just carrying a couple of hundred people. Africa cannot support its present population. And that is why these UN projections of Africa in the year 2100 with a population of over 4 billion are unlikely to be accurate, because an awful lot of those 4 billion people are going to want to get out of Africa as soon as they can, and the place to go to is Europe. And that's really the argument that Stephen Smith is making in his book. It's not just the inversion of the traffic, but it's actually also the inversion over the last 50 years of the way the European ruling classes think. In the 19th century, it was presumed that, in the words of Rudyard Kipling, this was the white man's burden. You went to other parts of the world and you built the roads that Mr. Onyango Obo talks about in the East African, and you built schools and you built courthouses that promulgated a rule of law, and you built parliaments. You went to Africa and you did your best to make Africa better. Even accepting all the bad things about imperialism, looting the resources of the country, enslaving the people, make it as bad as you want. Nevertheless, the object, in a certain sense, even if it was only out of self-interest, was to make those places operate better. Now the European mindset is completely reversed, and we think it's better to move everybody to Europe. To take the people out of Africa, move them to Europe. We're doing people a favor when we let them get into these rickety boats off the coast of Libya, land them in Italy, let them go to Germany and live off European welfare systems. And a cultural argument is all there is. There is nothing more discredited, I think, today than the Wall Street Journal argument that immigration is a net benefit to the receiving countries. We know that's not the case. We know that automation is coming even faster than the demographic explosion in Africa, that in the next 10 years, almost all the low-skilled jobs and an awful lot of the medium-skilled jobs are going to become automated, and advanced societies will have to be grappling with the problem of how their populations lead lives of human dignity and worth when the assumptions that have underpinned society for millennia, that a man gets up in the morning and goes to work and is self-supporting and able to support his family, when all those assumptions are cast aside in nothing flat. Nobody is going to need mass immigration. No advanced society needs mass immigration. The only remaining justification for it is that somehow it demonstrates one's moral virtue, to culturally transform one's society in the interest of demonstrating how highly you prize the multicultural virtues. And that's why there's no end of starry-eyed sentimentalist Europeans who are willing to go and usher in these refugees in their boats and bring them to Italy or to Greece or to the beaches of Spain and usher them into Europe as a way of signaling their own virtue. The question then becomes, on the explosive rate of population growth in Africa that we have seen and which continues to accelerate beyond the low-balled UN estimates. So the 2015 revision revises it upward from the 2012 UN revision. The question then becomes, at what point does it simply become an unstoppable human tide? As I said, if you don't remember all the specific numbers, just remember this, that it's the fastest, never in the history of the planet has there been population growth on this scale. And I've tried all the tricks. I often start, when people ask me about demography, because it's the most basic question. The who determines the how, what, when, where, and why. The who is always the most important question. As I say in America alone, the future belongs to those who show up for it. And essentially ethnic European states, what were a generation ago ethnically homogenous European states, are declining roughly by a third with each generation. So in a certain sense, those fecund Europeans, the Spaniards, the Greeks, the Italians are all going out of business. Our cultural references are lagging indicators. For example, we all know films like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, or the cliches about the big Italian Catholic family, the trestle table in Tuscany, and the big Italian mama spooning out the pasta and the vino to tablefuls of uncles and aunts and cousins and things. Those societies, in reality, away from the cultural cliches, have upside-down family trees. Sweden, which was until the 70s, it could be hard put to find any visible immigrants in Sweden. Swedes will be an ethnic minority within Sweden by mid-century. This is a transformation. As I say, because everyone says, even to raise the subject, you're a big racy racist. I always try and talk about it. I always start off with a little light Turkish analogy. You'll know on one of these previous SteynPosts that we talked about the way Western secular Turkey had essentially been outbred by Eastern rural Islamic Turkey, so that the Kemalist Ataturk Turkey, it's not difficult to understand why Erdogan is now the new sultan in town, because the Kemalists basically got outbred by this irredentist rural Anatolian Turkey. There's nothing racist about that. They're Turks. If you put them side by side, they look pretty much the same. There's no differences in skin color or anything like that. It's just a different ethos that has hugely transformed the nature of Turkey, and in effect, after just shy of a century, eliminated, to all intents and purposes, Kemal Ataturk's vision for Turkey. So this doesn't have to be about race, doesn't have to be about anything like that. It's simply the harsh reality. And I've waited, after what happened to me a decade or so back, where there's nothing in America alone that is wrong. There is nothing in America alone that people take specific issue with. It's simply that the powers that be don't want us talking about this. And I've waited for someone to come along, someone so impeccably reasonable that he will be able to talk about this subject in a way that will make people understand that we are seeing a paradigm shift that will have huge consequences for the future of the world. Stephen Smith is a respectable man. In France, he is now damned as a racist for wishing to talk about this subject and for positing theories on saying what happens if African migration to Europe is like Mexican migration to the United States and all the rest of it. But they don't take issue with any of his theses. They simply say to him, you are a racist even for wanting to discuss it. And we should discuss it, because this is the biggest story of our time. And if you look at these UN population graphs that show the way Europe's population and Africa's smaller population, Europe's declines, Africa's increases, Africa accelerates, it all comes back to demography. Why did the British end up ruling the earth? Because they were the first society to conquer childhood mortality. So people in the early 19th century had children, and instead of half those children dying, they all lived. And a lot of them got on boats and went and settled Canada and Australia and New Zealand, and others went out to India and to Africa. And they eventually governed 1/4 of the world because they were the most demographically secure people. It was easier to, certain things like the British class system didn't apply when you went to India or Africa. You had more social mobility out there, so there were incentives to go. If you look at Afghanistan, for example, no American policeman wants to go and be a police chief in Kandahar or whatever. There's nothing in it for him. So things are different. But it all began with demography. It all began with having surplus populations that you send out across the world. And what is going on in Africa, because if you go back 100 years, basically the British Isles and British West Africa, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales had the same population as the Gambia and Nigeria and all the other countries of British West Africa. Now British West Africa, what was British West Africa, has exploded in population, and there's been barely any growth in England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. This means something. These UN population projections will determine the course of the 21st century. And we should all demand, like Stephen Smith, the right at least to be able to discuss what exactly they do mean. The people who are telling Stephen Smith and co that they're racist and they should just shut up and they're not allowed to mention it, we absolutely have the right to mention it, and indeed we have the duty to mention it and consider what it means. I'll see you next time.